The diplomatic firestorm between Iran and Donald Trump reached new heights in February 2026, when Tehran publicly rejected what it called unequal and unacceptable terms in the latest nuclear negotiations and demanded parity, a deal based on equality and respect rather than conditional surrender. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, speaking before tens of thousands in Azadi Square on February 11, 2026, stated bluntly that Tehran will not yield to excessive demands in its dealings with Washington, even as indirect talks resumed for the first time since last summer's Middle Eastern conflict. He stressed that Iran was open to any verification of its nuclear program, but insisted that its fundamental rights, including uranium enrichment, could not be traded away under duress, framing the U.S. approach as an attempt to impose dictates rather than engage in an equal and fair diplomatic process. The rejection came amid renewed indirect negotiations mediated by Oman and involving U.S. envoys and Iranian officials, signaling that the talks had advanced to a stage where substantive proposals were being discussed. Yet instead of moving toward compromise, Iran's leadership doubled down on its conditions, with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stating months earlier that the U.S. was not ready for equal and fair negotiations, and that Washington appeared to be pursuing wartime objectives through diplomatic channels. Araghchi reiterated that Iran would engage in diplomacy only if the terms respected Tehran's sovereign rights and did not seek to impose unilateral constraints. President Trump's response was immediate, forceful, and unprecedented in tone. On February 12, 2026, he warned from the White House that if Tehran refuses to agree to what the U.S. defines as a fair deal, one that includes stringent curbs on enrichment and clear rollback mechanisms, the consequences would be very traumatic for Iran. Trump did not shy away from implying military pressure, asserting that a deal must materialize over the next month, or risks escalating toward confrontation. This statement came one day after he hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with whom he coordinated positions on Iran's nuclear ambitions and broader regional security concerns. That sharp rhetoric was compounded by significant on-the-ground military repositioning. In a dramatic escalation reported simultaneously on February 13, 2026, Trump ordered the redeployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, to join the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Middle East, a clear signal that Washington is preparing for scenarios beyond diplomatic negotiation. This military buildup adds palpable tension to a diplomatic theater already fraught with distrust and competing red lines. The crux of the dispute revolves around how to balance nuclear limits with sanctions relief. Iran has repeatedly insisted its nuclear program serves peaceful purposes, a position it has reiterated publicly while rejecting U.S. demands to halt enrichment or eliminate key components of its nuclear infrastructure. Tehran's insistence on preserving its enrichment capabilities as non-negotiable reflects both strategic calculation and domestic political constraints within Iranian leadership. Meanwhile, Trump's administration, backed by Israeli and some Arab allies, links sanctions relief and diplomatic normalization to rigorous transparency and irreversible caps on enrichment. These opposing positions have left a deep diplomatic chasm that neither side has yet shown readiness to bridge. For global markets, this standoff is already producing volatility. Oil prices have reacted to rising geopolitical risk, while defense equities rally on expectations of heightened regional tension. The broader international community, from Saudi Arabia to European capitals, is urging restraint. But both Washington and Tehran appear committed to holding their ground for now. Critics argue that Trump's mention of regime change language and sustained military presence risks broadening the crisis beyond nuclear diplomacy into outright strategic confrontation. The real shock lies not just in Iran's demand for an equal deal, but in how raw and public the clash has become. Tehran is no longer negotiating quietly in back channels. It is asserting conditions loudly, defiantly, and on its own terms. Washington, for its part, is matching that defiance with threats of trauma and force, even as it claims to pursue peace. The clock is ticking, the stakes are global, and what was once behind closed doors in Vienna and Muscat now plays out in public speeches, carrier deployments, and daily market fluctuations. The world is watching a crisis where diplomatic language and military power are colliding with unprecedented intensity. The diplomatic firestorm ignited in early 2026 over Iran's insistence on an equal and fair deal did not erupt spontaneously. It emerged from a deep buildup of mistrust, conflicting objectives, and uncompromising red lines that have characterized U.S. Iran relations for nearly a decade. The roots of the crisis extend back to 2018, when Donald Trump abandoned the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a multilateral nuclear agreement that had capped Iran's enrichment and opened the door to sanctions relief. That U.S. withdrawal shattered a framework Tehran once saw as a path to economic reintegration and stability, prompting Tehran to rapidly expand its uranium enrichment program to levels as high as 60% purity, just a short technical leap from weapons-grade material. When the new talks began in late 2025 and early 2026, Iran's negotiating position was shaped not only by these technical achievements but by a deep political conviction that its rights under international law had been trampled by unilateral U.S. action, a conviction repeatedly reinforced by senior Iranian officials and explained publicly as resistance to what they describe as dictated negotiations that seek to deny Iran parity or sovereign dignity. That historical context matters because it explains why Tehran rejected proposals perceived as dictated or unbalanced, rather than negotiated on equal footing. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has repeatedly stated that Iran will not accept negotiations aimed at enforcing sweeping concessions while offering no guarantee that Tehran's rights, including uranium enrichment for peaceful use, will be respected. On January 28, 2026, Araghchi emphasized on social media that Iran welcomes a mutually beneficial, fair and equitable nuclear deal on equal footing, free from coercion, threats and intimidation, while also guaranteeing Iran's right to peaceful nuclear technology. This framing directly challenges U.S. demands for complete suspension of enrichment and the unilateral rollback of Iran's nuclear program. The equal deal demand reflects Tehran's broader strategic calculation. It seeks not merely a transactional agreement but a reset of diplomatic norms that acknowledges its self-described sovereign rights. Iranian leaders point to the failed implementation of previous agreements, most notably the 2018 U.S. withdrawal, as evidence that only a deal built on reciprocal guarantees, rather than a list of unilateral demands, can endure. In practice, this has meant Iran conditioning progress in nuclear talks on significant sanctions, relief and assurances that future U.S. administrations cannot simply reverse terms as happened previously. Even as Tehran publicly expresses willingness to negotiate, its diplomatic language underscores a refusal to accept terms that it perceives as serving only U.S. or allied strategic interests. This tension underlies Iran's response in the latest indirect talks mediated through Oman, which Iranian officials characterized as conducted in a positive atmosphere, but also emphasized that any continuation depends on meaningful respect for Iran's interests and rights. On the American side, the response has been one of frustration and escalating rhetoric. Trump and his aides have oscillated between portraying the talks as potentially productive and threatening severe consequences if Iran does not capitulate to terms framed as non-negotiable for U.S. national security. On February 12, 2026, Trump warned that failure to reach a deal within a matter of weeks could lead to very traumatic consequences for Tehran, pairing that message with aggressive military preparation, including carrier deployments and threats of force. That public posture, mixing diplomatic engagement with implied coercion, has been sharply criticized by analysts and foreign capitals for undermining the very conditions necessary for genuine negotiation. Underlying these conflicting narratives are competing definitions of what constitutes a deal. Washington has frequently insisted on stringent limits on enrichment, comprehensive inspections, and reductions in nuclear infrastructure. Tehran, by contrast, has insisted that any agreement must respect its right, guaranteed under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to civilian nuclear development without facing punitive provisions that would strip it of essential capabilities or subject it to indefinite external oversight without equivalently enforceable commitments from the U.S. and its allies. These irreconcilable positions speak not simply to tactical negotiating differences, but to structural misalignment regarding sovereignty, dignity, and mutual trust. A misalignment amplified by decades of sanctions, military threats, and broken agreements. In this context, Iran's demand for an equal deal is more than a diplomatic posture. It is an expression of decades of strategic distrust and national sovereignty claims that clash directly with Washington's insistence on verifiable concessions as the price of sanctions relief. As the 2026 negotiations continue to unfold under intense international scrutiny, the clash over what constitutes equal footing and who gets to define it may prove the most enduring obstacle to achieving a lasting and stable agreement. The current standoff between Iran and Donald Trump isn't confined to diplomatic statements in Vienna and Muscat. It is producing concrete, measurable human and economic fallout that is rippling across the Middle East, global markets, and everyday lives. Within days of Iran's public demand for an equal deal and Trump's furious February 12, 2026 warning of very traumatic consequences if Tehran does not comply, global oil markets reacted sharply. Brent crude surged above $110 per barrel, pushing fuel costs higher for consumers and businesses around the world. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil supply passes, spiked to multi-year highs amid fears of escalation. These pricing shifts are not abstract numbers. They translate directly into higher gasoline prices at pumps in the United States, increased heating bills in Europe, and rising transportation costs for food and goods in Asia and Africa. The economic pain is already filtering down from macroeconomic markets to household budgets, long before any actual conflict might occur. The human impact is not limited to energy prices. In Iran, the partial re-imposition and tightening of sanctions following the collapse of earlier negotiations have real everyday consequences. Healthcare facilities in Tehran and other major cities report chronic shortages of imported medical supplies and spare parts for critical diagnostic equipment, with several hospitals publicly confirming in early 2026 that they have postponed non-urgent procedures due to supply constraints. Iranian civil society groups warned in January 2026 that patients requiring pediatric cancer drugs face intermittent access as payments for imported pharmaceuticals are increasingly restricted by banking restrictions tied to sanctions enforcement. These are not isolated anecdotes. They reflect documented supply chain disruptions exacerbated by financial isolation and counterparty risk in international markets. Across the Gulf, ordinary workers are experiencing economic unease as geopolitical risk climbs. Construction firms contracted to build energy infrastructure, transportation hubs, and defense facilities have begun to delay hiring and equipment purchases amid uncertainty about future federal contracts and financing costs. Ports in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, which handle millions of tons of cargo tied to global supply chains, reported a noticeable slowdown in container throughput in the first weeks of February 2026, as shippers opt for alternative routes to mitigate risk. Logistics managers at major firms observed that the region's risk premium has increased so dramatically that shipping lines are now temporarily rerouting vessels to avoid the Strait of Hormuz, escalating costs and delivery times for exporters and importers. These operational shifts affect not only energy products but electronics, foodstuffs, manufacturing components, and raw materials that underpin global commerce. The human stories behind these economic stressors bring the situation into sharper relief. In southern Israel, where citizens have lived with periodic missile alert drills since the 2024 escalation, families report renewed anxiety as diplomatic tensions spike. Parents speak openly of disrupted sleep patterns, heightened stress, and children's increasing reluctance to attend school on days when sirens are tested. Nurses and emergency responders describe being called in for unscheduled shifts amid heightened readiness levels, diverting attention from routine care to contingency planning for possible conflict. Fallout. That psychological strain is an often overlooked consequence of geopolitical brinkmanship, but it directly affects community well-being and social stability. In northern Iraq and eastern Syria, regions with active Iranian-aligned militia networks, local communities report economic stagnation as businesses confront uncertainty about security and investment. Restaurants, shops, and local markets dependent on cross-border trade have seen foot traffic decline in early 2026, according to regional chambers of commerce, as fear of escalation pushes both local residents and visitors to curtail economic activity. That decline compounds long-standing economic malaise in these areas, where employment opportunities are already limited and populations are acutely sensitive to changes in regional risk assessments. The broader global economy is not immune. Analysts at leading financial institutions warned in mid-February 2026 that prolonged geopolitical tension over the Iran deal could shave up to 0.3 to 0.5% off global GDP growth in 2026, primarily through energy price inflation, supply chain disruption, and investment deferral. Even if conflict is ultimately averted, that economic drag is not easily reversed. Business confidence and capital flows react quickly to elevated risk and just as slowly to de-escalation. And through all of this, ordinary citizens, from commuters paying more at the pump to nurses rationing care to logistics workers navigating higher premiums and rerouted shipments, are already feeling the consequences of a diplomatic deadlock that has morphed into economic distress and psychological strain. These are real, measurable impacts tied directly to how Tehran and Washington choose to negotiate or refuse to compromise on the terms of a future nuclear accord. At the center of this escalating diplomatic rupture is a stark clash of leadership choices and strategic miscalculations that have driven the U.S. Iran negotiations to the brink of broader confrontation. Donald Trump has publicly framed the renewed nuclear talks as a test of resolve, a deal now or consequences later. And he has repeatedly paired diplomatic engagement with threats, implying that failure to reach terms favorable to Washington could bring not just increased sanctions but military pressure. On February 12 and 13, 2026, Trump's rhetoric hardened dramatically, warning of very traumatic outcomes for Tehran and publicly endorsing regime change as the best thing that could happen in Iran. These remarks were coupled with expanded military deployments to the Middle East, including newly ordered carriers and missile defenses, creating an unmistakable message that Washington's patience is limited and that Trump intends to fuse diplomatic leverage with strategic force if necessary. Tehran's leadership has responded not just with defiance but with its own political narrative of accountability, painting the United States as inconsistent and coercive. Iranian officials have repeatedly insisted that they are prepared to negotiate, but only on equal footing and without dictation, which Tehran interprets as respect for its sovereign rights and the inclusion of economic relief tethered to the lifting of sanctions. According to Iranian Foreign Ministry statements, Washington's approach has lacked what Tehran calls mutual respect for interests and rights, leading Iran to publicly dismiss U.S. readiness for equal and fair negotiations. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said that the U.S. cannot expect to gain what it couldn't in war through negotiations, a direct indictment of the U.S. strategy and a clear signal that Iran believes the administration's posture is aimed at enforcing unilateral terms rather than crafting a balanced deal. That Iranian framing is significant because it reflects deep distrust rooted in past diplomatic failures, particularly the 2018 U.S. withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal under Trump's first presidency. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has echoed this viewpoint for years, arguing that Iran has been repeatedly undermined by U.S. diplomatic reversals, a view reinforced by Tehran's refusal to suspend enrichment or revert to pre-2018 limits without concrete, enforceable guarantees of sanctions relief. This historic distrust has seeped into Tehran's negotiating posture, crystallizing into firm conditions for renewed diplomacy that Tehran views as non-negotiable. The accountability also extends to the way regional partners have influenced the discourse. Israel's government, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has lobbied Washington to expand the scope of talks beyond nuclear restrictions to include ballistic missiles, regional proxy groups, and human rights concerns, demands Tehran deems external interference aimed at diluting its sovereignty. Iranian officials have gone so far as to urge Washington not to let Netanyahu derail negotiations, underscoring how external influence complicates an already strained bilateral dialogue. Within the United States, geopolitical critics and allies alike are placing responsibility on Trump for a strategy that mixes diplomacy with pressure tactics that many analysts consider contradictory. On one hand, White House statements signal eagerness to engage. On the other, Trump's persistent emphasis on military readiness, regime change talk, and threats if Iran does not do what Washington wants have undercut trust-building efforts. That mixed messaging has made it harder for Tehran to see a pathway toward a deal that protects its core strategic interests. Some U.S. lawmakers have echoed concerns that a head-on confrontation between political rhetoric and diplomatic outreach risks alienating potential moderates in Tehran who might favor compromise if given credible assurances, not threats. Iran's internal political dynamics add another layer of controversy. While nominally open to negotiations, Tehran is simultaneously grappling with widespread domestic unrest and a heavy-handed crackdown that, according to Iranian activists, has resulted in thousands of casualties as of 2026. This humanitarian dimension strengthens Iran's bargaining posture by presenting Tehran's leaders as defenders of national resilience and opponents of external domination, while also exposing them to international criticism for internal repression. That dual narrative, resisting external pressure while facing internal dissent, allows Tehran's hardliners to justify tough negotiating stances as necessary for national survival. The result is a potent and combustible mix, a U.S. leadership perceived by Tehran as inflexible and threatening, Iranian leadership portrayed domestically as resolute and sovereign, and regional players exerting influence that deepens mistrust from both sides. Accountability in this crisis is not simple. It is shared, multi-layered, and deeply political. Each side blames the other for escalation. Yet both have contributed to a standoff that is now as much about prestige and strategic positioning as it is about nuclear verification. The controversy driving the deadlock is a vivid demonstration that leadership choices, whether in rhetoric, military posture, or diplomatic strategy, can escalate tension just as quickly as they can resolve it. The reverberations from the diplomatic deadlock between Iran and the Trump administration are not confined to the negotiating table. They are shaping the strategic, economic, and humanitarian architecture of the region and the world. As of February 2026, Iran's insistence on an equal and fair deal anchored in sovereign enrichment rights, sanctions relief, and legal guarantees that future U.S. administrations cannot unilaterally reverse agreements, collides with Donald Trump's uncompromising demands for verifiable rollback and stringent limits on Tehran's nuclear program. This persistent impasse, welded together with public threats of very traumatic consequences, has illuminated a trajectory far more perilous than conventional diplomacy suggests, and the long-term consequences are now emerging with frightening clarity. At the strategic level, the greatest risk is that geopolitical escalation becomes normalized. Energy markets are already pricing in sustained risk premiums, with Brent crude hovering above $110 per barrel in mid-February 2026, following repeated threats and direct military deployments, including the newly ordered positioning of the USS Gerald R. Ford and the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike groups in the Middle East. Persistent volatility in energy prices threatens inflationary pressures in Europe, Asia, and North America alike, a stark reminder that unresolved geopolitical disputes can ripple outward into global economic instability. Shipping insurers have raised premiums on tankers transiting conflict-prone waters, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, which handles roughly 20% of the world's oil. This sustained risk premium is not a short-term blip. Traders and analysts warn it could persist for years if diplomatic gridlock erodes confidence in supply stability. Economic decline is also now measurable in regional economies. In Iran, continued sanctions enforcement magnified by the current impasse has constrained import channels for critical goods. Iranian hospitals, as recently reported in early 2026, are routinely delaying non-urgent procedures due to persistent shortages of imported medicines and diagnostic equipment, underscoring how macro-level strategic conflict translates into human suffering. Families in urban centers face inflationary pressures on basic goods, with food prices up significantly over the past year as financial isolation deepens. Meanwhile, neighboring Gulf states, traditionally reliant on robust trade flows through the Persian Gulf, are experiencing noticeable downturns in logistics activity, as some international shippers reroute vessels or delay cargo commitments amid heightened threat assessments. These shifts are reflected in declining port throughput statistics in key regional hubs throughout early 2026. Long-term infrastructure and development projects are also being jeopardized. Billions in planned investment in renewable energy collaboration, water desalination projects, and cross-border transportation corridors have been delayed or deferred entirely because private financing partners are increasingly reluctant to commit capital in a high-risk regional environment. Emerging markets that had anticipated roads, rail links, and expanded energy grids now face cost increases due to deferred federal funding timelines and investor caution. This structural slowdown has implications far beyond geopolitics. It impacts employment, public services, and the livelihoods of millions who depend on predictable growth and development. Worst-case projections paint an even more unsettling picture. Should diplomatic breakdown harden into kinetic conflict, even a limited engagement, the economic shock could widen into a global recessionary spiral. Defense analysts have warned that conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, even for a short duration, could elevate oil prices to $150 per barrel or higher within weeks, squeezing consumers globally and triggering cascading inflation across commodities, transportation, and manufacturing sectors. Supply chain disruptions would be immediate and severe, with food security becoming a critical issue in nations already dealing with elevated inflation and climate-linked agricultural stress. The long-term human cost could quickly eclipse even the direst scenarios of the past decade, affecting not only regional populations but global prosperity. The humanitarian dimension also looms large. Continued geopolitical tension threatens to entrench socioeconomic inequality. Communities in southwestern Iran, northern Israel, and southern Lebanon, regions already exposed to intermittent escalatory exchanges, face chronic disruption to education, healthcare, and employment. Schools operating under frequent alert protocols see attendance decline. Healthcare systems strained by resource shortages struggle to provide routine care. Local businesses operate on razor-thin margins as consumer demand weakens. The human toll is already visible in these communities and is poised to expand if diplomatic impasse continues. Ultimately, the geopolitical future the world now faces is not static and not predetermined, and it is a choice point driven by leadership decisions, institutional disengagement, and competing strategic priorities. The unresolved question is not whether tensions will worsen. The indicators suggest they already are, but how long global populations will tolerate the erosion of economic stability, human security, and diplomatic credibility in the pursuit of entrenched positions. With each passing month of stalled negotiations, heightened rhetoric, and elevated risk premiums, the seeds of long-term instability grow stronger. The question is stark and sobering. Will the world choose diplomacy built on mutual guarantees and enforceable norms, or continue down a volatile path where brinkmanship becomes the defining logic of international order? The answer will shape decades of energy markets, humanitarian outcomes, and the very architecture of global stability.